When we think of Vlad III Țepeș, the image of the fearsome Wallachian prince, nicknamed the Impaler, often comes to mind. A man of legend, dread, and iron rule. His brutal methods of warfare and punishment have echoed through centuries, inspiring countless tales of horror and political intrigue. But what of his children? The next generation of the Drăculești dynasty inherited not just his name, but his tangled legacy of war, politics, and survival. These were real people, princes, potential rulers, and heirs to one of medieval Europe's most notorious bloodlines. In this video, we will answer a question rarely asked. What happened to Vlad the Impaler's children? From those who died young, to princes who briefly ruled, to claimants lost to history, we will trace their births, their struggles, their families, and the mark they left behind. This is not a horror story, but a lineage story, measured, chronological, and factual. Stay with us as we turn the spotlight from the famous father to the lives of his offspring. Before we dive in, if you enjoy clear, no-nonsense history told chronologically, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. And do me a favor, drop a quick comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Your answers help me tailor these stories to you. To understand the fate of Vlad's children, we must first grasp the world they were born into. 15th century Wallachia was a principality caught between empires, the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north. This was a land where political survival depended on shifting alliances, military prowess, and the ability to navigate between Christian and Muslim powers. Vlad III Drăculești ruled Wallachia intermittently between 1448 and 1476. His father, Vlad II Dracula, had been inducted into the Order of the Dragon, hence the family name Drăculești, meaning sons of the dragon. But Vlad III's reputation was built on more than noble orders. His methods of dealing with enemies, particularly his preference for impalement, earned him the epithet Țepeș, the Impaler. When Vlad III died in 1476, likely killed in battle against the Ottomans, he left behind a legacy that was both fearsome and politically complex. His children would inherit not just claims to the Wallachian throne, but the weight of their father's reputation, a name that could open doors or seal fates, depending on the political winds. The Drăculești dynasty didn't end with Vlad the Impaler's death. His children carried forward the bloodline, each navigating their inheritance in different ways. Some would rule, others would disappear into history's shadows. Their stories reveal how the children of notorious figures must balance heritage with survival, ambition with reality. Let us now examine what we know and what remains uncertain about these heirs to one of Europe's most infamous medieval rulers. Mihnea the Evil, known to history as Mihnea the Evil, was born around 1462, making him one of Vlad the Impaler's younger children. Records indicate he was the son of Vlad III and an unnamed noblewoman, though some sources suggest his mother may have been from a Wallachian boyar family allied with the Drăculești. The exact circumstance of Mihnea's birth remain unclear, as was common for medieval illegitimate children, even those of royal blood. What we do know is that he was recognized by his father and raised within the context of Wallachian court politics. This recognition was crucial. It meant Mihnea had legitimate claims to his father's titles and territories, despite questions about his mother's identity. Born during one of the most turbulent periods of his father's reign, Mihnea's early years were shaped by constant warfare and political instability. Vlad III was fighting on multiple fronts, against Ottoman forces, Hungarian rivals, and internal opposition from Wallachian boyars who questioned his increasingly brutal methods. For a child growing up in this environment, violence and political calculation weren't abstract concepts, but daily realities. The young Mihnea would have witnessed the consequences of political miscalculation, the importance of strong alliances, and the price of showing weakness to enemies. When Vlad III died in 1476, Mihnea was approximately 14 years old enough to understand the significance of his father's death, but too young to immediately claim power in his own right. The court environment that shaped Mihnea's formative years was unlike any typical noble household of the period. Vlad III's court was characterized by paranoia, swift justice, and the constant presence of foreign advisors and hostages. The prince maintained contacts with both Hungarian and Ottoman courts, often playing one against the other. Modern scholarship suggests that Mihnea received a mixed education that combined traditional Wallachian military training with diplomatic skills necessary for navigating the region's complex politics. Like many sons of medieval rulers, he would have learned swordsmanship, horsemanship, and battlefield tactics. But equally important was his education in languages likely including Hungarian, Ottoman Turkish, and Church Slavonic, the liturgical language of Wallachian Christianity. The influence of his father's methods on young Mihnea cannot be understated. Vlad III's court was a place where loyalty was rewarded and treachery punished with spectacular brutality. Foreign visitors reported seeing fields of impaled enemies around Wallachian settlements, and the young Mihnea would have grown up understanding that political power required both the willingness to use violence and the intelligence to know when restraints served better purposes. However, Mihnea's upbringing also involved exposure to broader European culture. Wallachian nobles maintained connections with courts in Buda, Constantinople, and even Venice. This cosmopolitan influence tempered the more provincial aspects of Wallachian court life and gave future rulers like Mihnea a broader perspective on international politics. The death of Vlad III in 1476 dramatically altered Mihnea's circumstances. No longer the son of a reigning prince, he became a political refugee whose claims to power depended on foreign support and internal Wallachian politics. The teenage Mihnea found himself in the precarious position of being valuable enough to protect but dangerous enough to watch carefully. This period of uncertainty, from his father's death until his own eventual rise to power, lasted nearly 2 decades and fundamentally shaped Mihnea's approach to rule when he finally achieved it. Following Vlad III's death, Wallachia experienced a period of instability with multiple claimants vying for the throne. Mihnea spent much of his youth and early adulthood in exile, primarily in the Ottoman Empire, where he cultivated relationships that would prove crucial to his later political success. The Ottoman court had complex relationships with Wallachian nobility. While they were enemies of Vlad III, they recognized the value of having puppet rulers who could provide legitimacy to Ottoman influence in the region. Mihnea's Drăculești bloodline, combined with his willingness to work within Ottoman political frameworks, made him an attractive candidate for their support. During his years in Ottoman territories, Mihnea developed diplomatic skills and political alliances that his father, with his more confrontational approach, had never cultivated. He learned to present himself as a stabilizing force who could bring order to Wallachia while respecting Ottoman suzerainty. This was a delicate balance, appearing strong enough to control internal opposition while remaining non-threatening to Ottoman interests. By the mid-1490s, political conditions in Wallachia had deteriorated under a series of weak rulers. The boyar class was divided, economic conditions were poor, and both Hungarian and Ottoman influence were competing for dominance. These circumstances created an opportunity for Mihnea to present himself as a legitimate alternative. In 1495, with Ottoman backing, Mihnea launched his bid for the Wallachian throne. His campaign was remarkably swift and decisive. Unlike his father's reliance on military force and intimidation, Mihnea combined political negotiation with strategic violence. He successfully convinced several major boyar families to support his claim, while eliminating opposition through targeted assassinations rather than mass executions. The key to Mihnea's success was his ability to present his rule as both a restoration of Drăculești legitimacy and a break from his father's more extreme methods. He promised stability, economic recovery, and a more collaborative relationship with the nobility. At the same time, his Ottoman backing provided external legitimacy and military support when needed. By late 1495, Mihnea had successfully established himself as voivode of Wallachia. His rise to power demonstrated that the Drăculești name still carried significant political weight, but also showed how the next generation had learned to adapt their father's legacy to changing circumstances. The transition from exile to rule took nearly 20 years, but it positioned Mihnea as arguably the most successful of Vlad the Impaler's children in terms of achieving sustained political power. Mihnea's reign as voivode of Wallachia lasted from 1495 to 1508, 13 years that would earn him the epithet Vlad the Evil, and establish him as a notable ruler in his own right, distinct from his father's shadow. Contemporary accounts suggest that Mihnea's early years as voivode were marked by relative stability and economic recovery. He successfully negotiated tribute arrangements with the Ottoman Empire that were less burdensome than previous agreements, while maintaining enough autonomy to pursue internal reforms. His court attracted merchants and craftsmen, suggesting a degree of confidence in political stability. However, Mihnea's methods of maintaining power soon revealed similarities to his father's approach, albeit applied more selectively. He used targeted violence against political opponents, but unlike Vlad III's mass executions, Mihnea focused on eliminating specific threats while leaving broader social structures intact. This approach was more sustainable, but no less ruthless when circumstance required it. The epithet "the Evil" appears to have originated from his treatment of the merchant class in certain boyar families who opposed his policies. Several chronicles describe incidents where Mihnea ordered the execution of entire merchant families suspected of undermining state finances, and his suppression of a 1504 boyar revolt involved methods that shocked even his contemporaries. What distinguished Mihnea from his father was his sophisticated understanding of international diplomacy. He successfully balanced relationships with the Ottoman Empire, the Kingdom of Hungary, and emerging Moldavian power centers. This diplomatic skill allowed him to maintain Wallachian autonomy far longer than many of his predecessors or successors. Mihnea also demonstrated interest in cultural and religious affairs that had been secondary concerns for his father. He patronized Orthodox monasteries, commissioned church construction, and maintained a court that attracted scholars and artists from across the region. These activities helped legitimize his rule among the general population and created a positive legacy beyond his political achievements. His economic policies focused on developing trade relationships and standardizing taxation, moves that strengthened central authority while providing resources for military and administrative needs. The stability of his reign allowed for infrastructure improvements and population growth that had been impossible during the constant warfare of his father's era. However, Mihnea's reign was not without its challenges. He faced several internal revolts, pressure from both Ottoman and Hungarian authorities, and the constant threat of rival claimants to the Wallachian throne. His responses to these challenges demonstrated both political acumen and the willingness to use his father's more brutal methods when necessary. The length and relative stability of Mihnea's reign marked him as one of the more successful Wallachian rulers of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Mihnea's personal life and family arrangements reflected the complex political realities of his position. He married strategically, forming alliances with prominent boyar families that strengthened his domestic political base while maintaining the Drăculești bloodline. His principal wife was from the influential Craiovesti family, a union that brought together two of Wallachia's most important noble houses. This marriage produced several children, though historical records about their exact number and individual fates vary significantly among different sources. The most historically significant of Mihnea's children was Mircea III, who would later briefly hold the Wallachian throne in 1509 to 1510. Mircea III's short reign demonstrated both the continued political relevance of Drăculești claims and the challenges facing any member of the family who sought to rule. Mihnea also had several daughters whose marriages were arranged to cement political alliances with other Wallachian noble families. These unions helped establish a network of kinship relationships that supported Drăculești interests for generations, even when direct male heirs were not occupying the throne. Historical records suggest that Mihnea may have had additional children from secondary marriages or relationships, as was common for medieval rulers. However, the documentation for these potential offspring is limited and often contradictory, making definitive statements about the full extent of his family difficult. What is clear is that Mihnea took great care to ensure his children received educations that prepared them for political leadership. They were trained in multiple languages, diplomatic protocols, and military skills. This investment in the next generation reflected Mihnea's understanding that political success required long-term planning and institutional continuity. The Drăculești line through Mihnea continued into the mid-16th century, with various descendants making claims to Wallachian leadership and maintaining the family's political relevance. However, none achieved the sustained success that Mihnea himself had accomplished. Some branches of the family eventually settled in other regions, particularly Transylvania and Moldavia, where they integrated into local noble hierarchies while maintaining their Drăculești identity. These scattered descendants helped preserve family traditions and historical memory, even as their direct political influence in Wallachia declined. The survival and partial success of Mihnea's line contrasted sharply with the fates of his siblings and half-siblings, making him the most successful of Vlad the Impaler's children in terms of establishing a lasting dynasty. Mihnea's relationship with his father's legacy was complex and evolved throughout his life. Unlike some children of notorious rulers who completely reject their inheritance, Mihnea selectively embraced aspects of his father's reputation while developing his own distinct political identity. In his rise to power, Mihnea explicitly invoked his Drăculești heritage as a source of legitimacy. He understood that his father's name, despite its dark associations, represented strong leadership and resistance to foreign domination, qualities that appealed to many Wallachians exhausted by weak rulers and foreign interference. However, Mihnea was also careful to distance himself from his father's most extreme methods. While he used targeted violence when necessary, he avoided the mass executions and public displays of brutality that had characterized Vlad III's reign. This approach allowed him to benefit from his father's reputation for strength while avoiding the political isolation that such extreme methods had ultimately caused. Contemporary chronicles suggest that Mihnea occasionally referenced his father in diplomatic contexts, particularly when dealing with Ottoman officials, who remembered Vlad III's effectiveness as a military opponent. This suggests that he understood how to leverage his inheritance strategically. The epithet Selro indicates that Mihnea ultimately developed his own fearsome reputation, but one based more on political calculation than his father's impulsive brutality. This evolution demonstrates how the next generation learned to adapt inherited traits to changing political circumstances. Mihnea's longest-lasting contribution to his father's legacy may have been his role in preserving and transmitting Drăculești political traditions to subsequent generations. Through his children and their descendants, elements of Vlad III's approach to leadership continued to influence Wallachian politics well into the 16th century, albeit in modified forms that reflected changing times and circumstances. Among the most tragic and historically obscure of Vlad the Impaler's children was a son whose name has been lost to history. Contemporary sources refer to him only indirectly, and his existence is primarily documented through references in Ottoman and Hungarian diplomatic correspondence from the 1470s. The unnamed son appears to have been born during the latter part of Vlad III's final reign, likely between 1465 and 1467. This timing placed his birth during one of the most violent and unstable periods of his father's rule, when Wallachian politics had devolved into a series of brutal conflicts with both internal and external enemies. Unlike Mihnea, whose mother's noble status provided some protection and political relevance, this younger son's maternal lineage remains completely unknown. Some historians speculate that his mother may have been a servant, captive, or member of a family that fell from political favor, which could explain both the lack of documentation and the child's ultimate fate. The brief mentions of this child in diplomatic correspondence suggest that his existence was known to foreign courts, indicating that he was acknowledged by his father and considered part of the legitimate succession, at least initially. However, the scarcity of references also suggests that he never achieved political prominence or lived long enough to become a significant factor in Wallachian succession disputes. The few historical fragments that reference this unnamed son paint a picture of a childhood shaped by extraordinary violence and instability. Born during a period when his father was engaged in increasingly desperate military campaigns against Ottoman forces, the child's early years would have been spent in a court atmosphere of siege mentality and constant preparation for warfare. Historical context suggests that this son's upbringing differed significantly from that of his older siblings. By the mid-1460s, Vlad III's political position had become precarious, with many traditional allies distancing themselves from his increasingly extreme methods. The court that had once attracted foreign visitors and diplomatic missions had become isolated and suspicious of outsiders. Unlike his brother Mihnea, who had been born earlier when Vlad III's position was more secure, this unnamed son had no opportunity to develop the political connections and diplomatic skills that would prove crucial for survival in the post-1476 political environment. His youth during the most chaotic period of his father's reign meant that his education was likely incomplete and focused primarily on immediate survival rather than long-term political preparation. Some sources suggest that this son may have been present during the final campaign that led to Vlad III's death in 1476. If accurate, this would mean that the child witnessed firsthand the collapse of his father's forces and the violent end of the Drăculești hold on power. Such traumatic experiences would have profoundly shaped his worldview and future prospects. The political chaos following Vlad III's death created an environment where legitimate heirs became targets for elimination by rival claimants. Children who could not defend themselves or lacked powerful protectors faced immediate threats to their survival, regardless of their bloodline's historical significance. The death of Vlad the Impaler's unnamed son appears to have occurred within a few years of his father's demise, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. Unlike the dramatic and well-documented death of Vlad III himself, his son's passing was noted only obliquely in later sources that reference the extinction of potential Drăculești claimants. The most likely scenario, based on the limited available evidence, is that the child died during the political upheaval that followed 1476. The new rulers of Wallachia had strong incentives to eliminate potential rival claimants, particularly those too young to defend themselves or negotiate political settlements. The systematic elimination of inconvenient heirs was a common practice in medieval succession disputes. Some historians have suggested that the unnamed son may have died of disease or accident rather than political violence, which would explain the lack of dramatic contemporary accounts. The late 15th century was a period of recurring plague outbreaks and other diseases that took heavy tolls on children, regardless of their social status. The death of this son represented more than just a personal tragedy. It marked the elimination of one branch of potential Drăculești succession. Each lost heir reduced the family's political options and concentrated remaining claims in fewer hands. This concentration could be advantageous for surviving heirs like Mihnea, who faced fewer rival claims, but it also increased the dynasty's vulnerability to complete extinction. The unnamed son's death also symbolized the broader cost of Vlad III's political methods. The extreme violence that had characterized his father's reign created enemies who remained hostile to any Drăculești restoration, making survival difficult for the next generation regardless of their personal actions or political positions. For historians studying the period, this lost son represents the limitations of medieval record-keeping and the particular challenges of documenting the lives of children who died before achieving political significance. The relationship between Vlad III and his unnamed son remains one of the most poignant mysteries in the Drăculești story. Unlike his relationship with Mihnea, which lasted long enough for political education and recognition, the bond between Vlad and this younger child was cut short by the political crisis that consumed the final years of his reign. Contemporary accounts suggest that Vlad III maintained affection for his children even amid his increasingly paranoid and violent political behavior. However, the practical demands of warfare and political survival would have limited his ability to provide normal paternal care, particularly for a child born during the most chaotic period of his rule. The loss of this son may have represented to Vlad III the personal cost of his political choices. A ruler who had built his reputation on the willingness to sacrifice others for political necessity found himself unable to protect his own child from the consequences of those same choices. For the Drăculești dynasty, this early death represented lost potential and a reminder of the fragility of political inheritance. The unnamed son's fate served as a cautionary tale for surviving family members about the importance of political alliances, personal protection, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. His memory, preserved only in fragments, reminds us that behind the grand narratives of medieval politics were real families facing very human struggles for survival. The third known son of Vlad the Impaler bore his father's name, Vlad, but is distinguished in historical records by the appellations Dracula or Dracula, variations that emphasized his Drăculești heritage, while differentiating him from his notorious father. Born around 1470, he was likely the youngest of Vlad III's acknowledged sons. Unlike his siblings, Vlad Drăculești's maternal lineage can be traced with somewhat greater confidence. Several sources suggest that his mother was a Hungarian noblewoman, possibly connected to the court of Matthias Corvinus, king of Hungary. This Hungarian connection would prove crucial to his later political opportunities and survival strategies. The timing of his birth coincided with a brief period when Vlad III was attempting to rebuild his political position through diplomatic rather than purely military means. During 1469 to 1470, the elder Vlad had been seeking Hungarian support for a return to the Wallachian throne, and a marriage alliance with a Hungarian noble family would have served multiple political purposes. If the Hungarian maternal connection is accurate, it would explain several aspects of young Vlad's later life, including his education in Hungarian court traditions, his fluency in Latin and Hungarian, and his eventual political support from Hungarian noble factions. It would also suggest that he had a very different upbringing from his half-brothers, one more influenced by Western European courtly culture than by traditional Wallachian customs. The name variants Dracula and Dracula appear in both Hungarian and German sources, suggesting that he was known in multiple European courts and that his identity as a Drăculești heir was widely recognized. This international recognition would later prove both advantageous and dangerous as he pursued his own political ambitions. His birth during this relatively stable period of his father's later career meant that he initially had better prospects for survival and political education than his unnamed brother. Vlad Drăculești's education appears to have been significantly more cosmopolitan than that of his siblings, reflecting both his mother's likely Hungarian origins and the political realities of his father's relationship with the Kingdom of Hungary. After Vlad III's death in 1476, the young Vlad found refuge in Hungarian territories, where he received an education that prepared him for a potential role in international politics. Historical records suggest that Vlad Drăculești spent significant time at the court of Matthias Corvinus and his successors. This environment exposed him to Renaissance humanist learning, Western military technologies, and diplomatic practices that were becoming standard throughout Central Europe. He learned Latin, the language of international diplomacy, and developed skills in written correspondence that would later serve his political ambitions. Unlike his brother Mihnea, who had learned to navigate politics primarily through Ottoman and Wallachian court traditions, Vlad Drăculești was trained in Hungarian and broader European political methods. This included understanding of feudal law, Catholic Church politics, and the complex web of alliances that connected Central European kingdoms. His military education likely included training in Western cavalry tactics and siege warfare, skills that differed significantly from the irregular warfare methods that had characterized his father's campaigns. This training would have made him potentially valuable to Hungarian military leaders, while also preparing him for eventual campaigns in Wallachian territory. The political education he received in Hungary emphasized negotiation, alliance building, and the importance of maintaining multiple diplomatic options simultaneously. These skills contrasted sharply with his father's more confrontational approach and suggested that the younger generation had learned important lessons about the limitations of relying solely on military force. However, Vlad Drăculești's Hungarian education also created potential problems for his eventual political ambitions in Wallachia. His identification with Hungarian court culture might have made him appear foreign to Wallachian nobles and common people, who had often viewed Hungarian influence as a threat to their autonomy. Despite these potential drawbacks, his education provided him with contacts and skills that his siblings lacked. By the 1490s, he had established relationships with Hungarian noble families, church officials, and even some merchant groups that could potentially support his political ambitions. The combination of his Drăculești bloodline and Western European political education made Vlad Drăculești a unique figure among the children of Vlad the Impaler, someone who might be able to bridge the gap between Wallachian traditions and broader European political trends. The year 1495 marked a crucial moment not only for Mihnea's successful seizure of the Wallachian throne, but also for his brother Vlad Drăculești's attempt to assert his own claims to their father's legacy. While Mihnea was consolidating power with Ottoman support, Vlad Dracula Jaoia launched a separate political venture backed by Hungarian interests. The political logic behind Vlad Dracula's 1495 claim was sophisticated and reflected his Western European political education. Rather than simply challenging Mihnea directly, he positioned himself as an alternative claimant who could serve Hungarian strategic interests while maintaining Drăculești legitimacy. This approach recognized that Wallachia's political future would likely depend on foreign support and that Hungarian backing might prove more sustainable than Ottoman patronage. His campaign began with diplomatic initiatives rather than military action. Through his Hungarian court connections, Vlad Dracula secured official recognition from several Hungarian noble families and church officials who viewed a Hungarian-backed Drăculești ruler as preferable to an Ottoman-supported one. This diplomatic foundation provided legitimacy for his claims while distinguishing his approach from his father's more purely military methods. The Hungarian political establishment had complex motivations for supporting Vlad Dracula's claims. A Wallachian ruler with strong Hungarian ties could serve as a buffer against Ottoman expansion while providing opportunities for Hungarian merchants and military advisors. At the same time, his Drăculești bloodline offered legitimacy that purely Hungarian appointees would lack. However, Vlad Dracula's campaign faced immediate practical difficulties. While his brother Mihnea had spent years building relationships within Wallachia itself, Vlad Dracula's Hungarian education had left him somewhat disconnected from domestic Wallachian politics. His supporters were primarily foreign, which weakened his appeal to local nobles and common people who were suspicious of external interference. The military aspect of his 1495 venture appears to have been limited and unsuccessful. Unlike Mihnea's carefully planned campaign that combined political negotiation with targeted violence, Vlad Dracula's efforts relied heavily on Hungarian military support that proved insufficient for conquering and holding Wallachian territory. By late 1495, it became clear that Mihnea had successfully consolidated power and that Vlad Dracula's Hungarian-backed challenge had failed. Rather than continuing a hopeless military campaign, he chose to retreat to Hungarian territories and Fearsome and pursue alternative political strategies. This failed attempt had several important consequences for Vlad Dracula's future prospects. It established him as a potential rival to Mihnea's rule, making future reconciliation between the brothers unlikely. It also demonstrated to Hungarian political leaders that while he had value as a diplomatic asset, his practical ability to control Wallachian territory was limited. The 1495 venture marked the high point of Vlad Dracula's political ambitions and his closest approach to achieving the power that his father had once wielded. Its failure forced him to reconsider his strategies and accept a more limited role in the complex politics of the region. The family life and descendants of Vlad Dracula represent one of the most uncertain aspects of the post-Impaler Drăculești story. Unlike his brother Mihnea, whose marriages and children are relatively well documented, Vlad Dracula's personal relationships and potential offspring remain largely mysterious to historians. Some sources suggest that following his failed 1495 political venture, Vlad Dracula settled into a quieter life within Hungarian noble society. If accurate, this would have likely involved marriage to a Hungarian noblewoman, as was customary for foreign nobility who integrated into local political structures. However, specific documentation of such a marriage has not been definitively established. The question of Vlad Dracula's descendants has generated considerable speculation among historians studying the broader Drăculești family tree. Several Hungarian noble families in Transylvania claimed Drăculești connections during the 16th and 17th centuries, and some of these claims may trace back to Vlad Dracula's lineage. One particularly intriguing possibility involves connections to the Bathory family, one of Transylvania's most powerful noble houses. Some genealogical research has suggested indirect connections between Vlad Dracula and certain Bathory family lines, though these connections remain speculative and would have been through marriage rather than direct descent. More concrete evidence exists for potential descendants who maintained Drăculești identity while integrating into Hungarian or Transylvanian political structures. These individuals typically appeared in local court records as de Dracula, or similar variants, suggesting that they preserved family naming traditions even while adapting to different political environments. The survival of potential Drăculești lineages through Vlad Draculia's line would have important implications for understanding how the family's political legacy evolved. Unlike the direct political succession attempted by Mihnea and his descendants, these Hungarian-connected branches would have represented a different model of elite survival, one based on integration rather than restoration. However, the lack of definitive documentation makes it impossible to establish clear genealogical connections between Vlad Dracula and later families claiming Drăculești heritage. This uncertainty reflects broader problems with medieval record-keeping, particularly for individuals who did not achieve sustained political prominence. What can be stated with confidence is that Vlad Draculia's Hungarian connections and political education created possibilities for family survival and integration that differed significantly from the paths taken by his siblings, even if the specific details of those connections remain unclear to modern researchers.
Vlad Draculia's relationship with his father's legacy was perhaps the most complex among all of Vlad the Impaler's children. His Hungarian education and political orientation created a unique perspective on how to understand and utilize his Drăculești inheritance. Unlike Mihnea, who selectively adapted his father's methods to contemporary political realities, Vlad Dracula appears to have largely rejected the violent approaches that had characterized Vlad III's reign. His political ventures emphasized diplomacy, legal claims, and international alliance building rather than the intimidation and brutal punishment that had defined his father's rule. This different approach reflected both his education and his strategic situation. As someone dependent on Hungarian political support, Vlad Dracula could not afford to develop a reputation for the kind of extreme violence that had ultimately isolated his father from potential allies. His political survival required demonstrating that he represented a more moderate and predictable alternative to other Drăculești claimants. However, Vlad Dracula still traded on his father's reputation when it served his purposes. His very name emphasized his Drăculești heritage, and he appears to have used his father's fearsome reputation as evidence of his family's traditional strength and legitimacy. This selective invocation of family legacy demonstrated sophisticated political calculation. The failure of his 1495 political venture may have influenced his later relationship with his father's memory. Success might have validated his more moderate approach as an evolution of Drăculești political methods, while failure suggested that complete departure from traditional approaches might also be insufficient for achieving power. Vlad Dracula's ultimate legacy lies in demonstrating alternative paths for how the children of notorious rulers might navigate their inheritance. His emphasis on education, international connections, and diplomatic methods offered a different model from his siblings' approaches, even if it ultimately proved less successful in achieving political power. His story illustrates both the opportunities and limitations facing any member of the next generation who sought to transform rather than simply inherit their family's political traditions. The stories of Vlad the Impaler's children reveal three very different responses to the challenge of inheriting one of medieval Europe's most notorious political legacies. Each son faced the same fundamental question: how to survive and potentially thrive while carrying the name of a ruler whose methods had both terrified enemies and alienated potential allies. Mihnea chose the path of selective adaptation. He embraced his father's reputation for strength while moderating the most extreme aspects of Drăculești political methods. His 13-year reign as voivode demonstrated that it was possible to build on his father's legacy while learning from his mistakes. Through careful political calculation, strategic alliances, and targeted rather than indiscriminate violence, Mihnea achieved a level of sustained success that had eluded his father in his final years. The unnamed son represents the tragedy of potential unfulfilled. His early death eliminated one branch of Drăculești succession and serves as a reminder of the human cost of medieval political upheaval. His story illustrates how political inheritance could become a death sentence for those too young to defend themselves or negotiate protection. In his brief life, he embodied the vulnerability that all of Vlad's children faced in the chaotic aftermath of 1476. Vlad Dracula pursued integration and transformation, seeking to reimagine what it meant to be a Drăculești heir in a changing political environment. His Hungarian education and diplomatic approach represented a radical departure from traditional family methods. While his political ventures ultimately failed, his path demonstrated how elite families could potentially preserve their status through adaptation rather than restoration. These three different approaches, adaptation, extinction, and transformation, illustrate the range of options available to the children of controversial rulers. None of the paths was guaranteed to succeed, and each carried its own risks and potential rewards. Mihnea's success was remarkable but temporary. His brother's tragedy was complete. Vlad Dracula's innovation was insufficient to achieve his goals. Together, their stories reveal how the next generation must balance respect for family heritage with recognition of changed circumstances. They also demonstrate that political inheritance involves much more than simple succession. It requires active choices about which aspects of a legacy to preserve, which to modify, and which to abandon entirely. The experiences of Vlad the Impaler's children offer insights into broader questions about how political identity is transmitted across generations and how controversial legacies are managed by succeeding family members. Their varied approaches to their father's reputation demonstrate that inheritance is an active process requiring constant negotiation between past and present. None of the children simply accepted their father's methods wholesale, nor did any completely reject their Drăculești identity. Instead, each developed strategies for managing a legacy that was simultaneously valuable and dangerous. The political context in which they operated, caught between Ottoman and Hungarian spheres of influence, forced them to develop sophisticated approaches to international relations that their father had never mastered. This suggests that political inheritance often requires skills and perspectives that go beyond those of the previous generation, even when that generation was notably successful. Their stories also reveal how political memory functions in medieval societies. The Drăculești name carried specific associations that could be leveraged for political advantage, but only if potential rulers could demonstrate that they offered more than mere repetition of past patterns. Each son had to prove that he represented evolution rather than simple restoration. The partial success of Mihnea and the failures of his brothers illustrate the narrow margins for error that characterized medieval political succession. Small differences in timing, alliances, or strategic choices could determine whether a family line continued to hold political relevance or disappeared into historical obscurity. Perhaps most importantly, their experiences demonstrate that the children of notorious rulers face unique challenges in establishing their own identities. They must simultaneously honor their heritage and distinguish themselves from it, preserve family advantages while avoiding family disadvantages, and convince contemporary audiences that they represent beneficial change rather than dangerous continuity. Despite centuries of historical research, significant gaps remain in our understanding of Vlad the Impaler's children and their descendants. These uncertainties are not merely academic curiosities. They reflect broader challenges in understanding how medieval political families adapted to changing circumstances. The most obvious gap involves potential children who may have existed but left no historical trace. Medieval record-keeping was often incomplete, particularly for children who died young or failed to achieve political prominence. The unnamed son story demonstrates how entire lives can be reduced to fleeting historical fragments. Questions about marriages, descendants, and family connections remain open for all three known sons. These uncertainties make it difficult to trace the full extent of Drăculești influence in subsequent generations, and to understand how the family's political legacy may have continued in modified forms. The gaps in documentation also raise questions about what we can confidently know about medieval family relationships and political inheritance patterns more generally. The Drăculești children's stories may be more representative than exceptional, suggesting that many aspects of medieval political history remain invisible to modern researchers. These uncertainties matter because they remind us that historical narratives are necessarily incomplete. The dramatic story of Vlad the Impaler has overshadowed the more complex but perhaps equally significant stories of how his children navigated their inheritance, and much of that navigation remains hidden from historical view. The children of Vlad the Impaler remind us that behind every historical legend are real families facing very human challenges of survival, adaptation, and identity. Their stories reveal that political inheritance is never automatic, and that each generation must actively choose how to engage with the legacy they receive. While Vlad III's reputation has dominated historical memory, his children's experiences offer different lessons about resilience, political calculation, and the complex relationship between past and present. Their varied fates demonstrate both the opportunities and perils of carrying a famous name in an unforgiving political environment. The intersection of family history and political strategy continues to offer insights into how individual choices shape historical outcomes, reminding us that the past was shaped by people making difficult decisions under uncertain circumstances, much like the challenges we face today.